Welcome back, party people. Mike here with The Social Life of Language, and today we're covering an article by scholar Krystal Smalls called Fighting Words, Antiblackness and Discursive Violence in an American High School. This article covers a very popular and very racist narrative that you kind of hear a lot in the news today. I'm referring to what some people call the so-called black on black violence narrative. Okay, let me get kind of dramatic here so nobody misses this point. The black on black violence narrative is a white supremacist myth, or in this case, an anti-black myth, period. Full stop. It's a narrative that claims there is something about black folks that is exceptionally violent or pathological, something barbaric and uncivilized, something without human morality or consciousness, something animalistic. For example, back in the 90s, Hillary Clinton went on TV talking about street gangs and the streets and the cities, all of which are code words for black boys and teens. Of course, she doesn't explicitly say that, but in this particular speech that she gave, she called these folks super predators.
The fourth challenge is to take back our streets from crime, gangs, and drugs. They are not just gangs of kids anymore. They are often the kinds of kids that are called super predators. No conscience, no empathy.
Again, no consciousness, no morality, no empathy. Oh, and by the way, how often do we refer to humans as predators? Because we generally reserve that word for animals hunting prey in the wild. But again, notice how she doesn't say black on black crime here, but in like 20 different ways, she's emphasizing that there's something pathological or deadly or super violent or super predatory about black folk. Now, in a different and more recent example, we have a clip from Fox News with two people describing the behavior of black police officers beating and killing a black civilian. Now, for whatever reason, this police murder was singled out as something super predatory in comparison to the way white police officers murder civilians, even though it was basically the exact same behavior.
I would examine the racial element of this because there is a racial element. And this is a story about young black men and their inability to treat each other in a humane way. Everybody involved in this on the street level was either 24 to 32 years old. Everybody. It was a group of young black men, 5-on-1. Looked like gang violence to me.
Okay, so first question here. Have you ever heard white police officers being described as a gang? No, of course not. Nobody's ever said that because these officers are black and the victim is black. This case was positioned as somehow extra super duper violent. Oh, and here's another question. Have you ever heard of brown on brown violence or Asian on Asian violence? Probably not, but that's because according to this anti-black myth, there is something super violent about black folk. Specifically. Now, if this narrative can be easily deconstructed and on the surface not even make sense a lot of the times, how is it that this narrative has remained so powerful? Let's find out. Before we get to the article, let's pull apart some of these huge ethno-racial categories. Categories like black or white or Latinx, and you'll see why in a minute. So first, we gotta know and accept that there is no unifying master culture within these categories that make everyone the same kind of person. For example, there are a million ways to be Latinx. You got Puerto Ricans in New York who may not have much in common with, let's say, Mexican English-speaking surfer dudes in California. So you see, within the category of Latinx, there are radical differences in cultures. Another thing to think about is that within groups that face stigmatization like on the daily, you tend to see this phenomenon where people from similarly stigmatized groups kind of turn on each other for a variety of reasons. For example, there are moments when, let's say, a Mexican American person might say something really messed up about an undocumented person. Kind of like saying, us Mexican Americans aren't the real problem. The real problem are those people over there, those illegals over there. We sometimes refer to this as a crabs in a bucket type of situation, where all the crabs are trying to get out of the bucket at the same time, and they inevitably end up pulling each other down in the process. So the reason why it's important to remember this is because in a white supremacist society, a lot of times racialized groups have to decide between a really bad choice and then another really bad choice. And often this includes blaming the next racialized person in an effort to hopefully not experience the form of racism that they experience. Similarly, blackness also comes in many forms, or what the author calls models of blackness. And in this article, the author focuses on tensions between, let's call them, two identity groups in an American high school. So on one side you had Black American teens, and then on the other side you had African immigrants in America. Now, for some of us standing on the outside of situations like this, some folks may not be aware that in certain communities, sometimes there are cultural or economic tensions between folks that have been in the United States for a while versus more recent immigrants. Now, in this article, we're going to hear people tell stories about this tension, which then very slowly gets reframed as an example of Black on Black violence. Actually, now is a good time to turn to the text. In this article, we hear about this big fight that broke out between a bunch of high school students, which included a Liberian teen named Timothy, who was beaten up by a group of Black American teens. It became one of those high school legends that was retold over and over again, where it seems like everybody knows what's up, but also everybody's version of the story is a little bit different. And depending who's telling the story, different parts are emphasized. But let's hear what Timothy, the boy who got jumped, let's hear what he had to say, how he described what was going on. What happened was, it was me and my other friend. I don't know, man. I don't know. They don't like me because I just don't know. But the other boy says that he's trying to fight me one-on-one and stuff. So I was like, I can't fight you one-on-one because it's y'all here. Y'all not gonna sit here and watch you get beat up. They going to try to jump in it, so it's not going to be a fair fight. Well, if you ain't going to fight, I'm still going to hit you, so it don't matter. So then I was walking, the other boy grabbed my neck, and then they started hitting me, and then this other one started hitting me. That's when my friend came in to help me, and then they left me and started hitting my friend too. They was kind of throwing rocks and shit at me, so I was trying to get away. As soon as I stepped on the street, the truck hit me. And after the truck hit me, they were still hitting me. That's when some man came and told me to stay down because I was trying to get up. He told me to stay down, and then he called the cops and stuff. That's when the police came and the ambulance and stuff took me to the hospital. So that's what happened. Okay, so in this first person account, notice how race is really not mentioned at all. And he expresses that he didn't really know why they were picking on him. Granted, there are probably reasons why he didn't go into the why, but we can't really know. Either way, Timothy didn't say anything about race. But when other people start telling the story, race, or specifically, blackness, becomes the most likely reason for the fighting. So let's look at some commentary offered by some of the adults at this high school who talk about either this event or similar events that happen in other high schools. Notice that in each of the following statements I'm going to present, no one explicitly says anything about Black on Black violence. But like we'll see, you don't have to. All you really gotta do is start speculating or guessing or suggesting that there's something racial going on here. And when a whole bunch of people's speculations start to add up and potentially overlap, people start believing that they know a little something something. People start believing certain things as true. Now, as we go over each of these statements, notice how each statement kind of acts like a puzzle piece. And those puzzle pieces are being assembled right in front of us to show a larger picture of what is happening, supposedly. Here's the first statement. Our author overheard a group of adults talking, and they said, "The Black kids and the African kids just don't seem to get along, I don't know what it is. If this statement was uttered inside a social vacuum where racism does not exist, then perhaps a person overhearing this statement might attribute the tensions to perhaps culture and nationality, or even just being the new immigrant kid in town. But we are not in a social vacuum. We are in a society where the black on black violence narrative exists. So whatever that's said about black folk potentially not getting along almost automatically has the potential to be understood or reframed as evidence of racial tensions. In other words, it has the potential to become a puzzle piece that is eventually understood as part of a larger black on black violence myth. Now, there's no guarantee it's going to work as a puzzle piece or become a puzzle piece, but it can, especially when you start pairing them with other statements. Suddenly, they start locking together. Listen to what this other teacher said. Quote, "These kids are rough. You don't want to mess with them too much. They've been through a lot." So here he's referring specifically to the African transnational students. Now, to me, when the teacher says, you don't want to mess with these kids, it kind of sounds like he's saying that they're ready to fight no matter what, because they supposedly went through a lot in Africa. Okay, so maybe this is true for some individual students, but this teacher is making a speculation about all kids from Africa. In other words, he's deploying a racial stereotype. But where did he get this racial stereotype from? Well, it's possible, probably even likely, that he's pulling from another anti-black myth. And this myth claims that Africa, like the whole ass continent, all of it emerged from a singular violent, barbaric, uncivilized culture, the whole continent. And honestly, this is where we get into some really tricky territory, because sometimes it sounds like we're just talking about a group's culture, and we're explicitly not talking about how someone's race leads to a person that supposedly has a violent behavioral nature. Because a statement like that just sounds like blunt racism. So we don't say that stuff anymore. But nowadays, you can kind of get away with saying some racist stuff about a group by claiming one is only talking about a group's culture. For example, today we wouldn't say Mexican students are lazy, but maybe we would say Mexican students' culture encourages laziness. But there is a subtext, something that is really being said underneath. Now, what's in the parentheses is not said out loud, but notice that the conclusion itself is still about a group's supposed behavioral nature. So here's what's happening. Nowadays, sometimes we tend to assert that certain cultures produce certain natures. Here's another example of this exact same type of logic. Listen to the following two statements and notice how the words I'm using change, but the final conclusion about behavioral nature is still there. So the fully racist statement that you would learn in white supremacist elementary school, that would sound something like, black kids from Africa are violent. Today we might hear something similar, but in more coded language. For example, something like, kids who grew up in violent African cultures grow up to be violent. In that second statement about cultures, whoever said that will very likely claim that they're not talking about race. They're just talking about things like oppression, social processes, trauma, etc., etc. And well, honestly, on its surface, it does look like a statement that's just about cultures. Here's the thing though. Instead of claiming nature produces nature, now we claim culture produces nature. The logic goes something like this. A violent culture created a violent group of people, and now it is their nature to be violent. Both the old school racist statement and then the newer one in more progressive language, both draw the exact same conclusions at the very end. Both presume a supposedly fixed and unchangeable nature of a particular group. So when we say things like, these kids are rough, you don't really want to mess with them, they've been through a lot, and whoever happens to overhear this statement might be led to draw the conclusion that all African kids are violent, but it's not their fault. They've been through a lot, so they're just like that now. So again, implying that fixed nature in the conclusion. Now look, sometimes folks really are talking about cultural conditions or the effects of colonial history and slavery. But those conversations usually tend to be much longer and way more nuanced and don't revolve around speculation and anecdotal evidence. In this article, we see people kind of just speculating. We see people kind of just speculating about a supposedly special or different behavioral nature of Black American students that seems to clash with the behavioral nature of African transnational students, whether they are wrapping the conclusion in the language of cultural difference or not. It almost always reduces to the exact same kind of racial logic. Certain kinds of humans exist in certain ways that are fixed by nature. Or, in the more progressive language, the nature of humans will become fixed if they grow up in certain cultures. Here's the thing. We don't claim that all cultures produced fixed natures. Only stigmatized cultures produce fixed natures. Okay, let's continue with some more quotes coming from the adults. Most of our fights happen between the Black students. Okay, let's refer to some basic common sense here. If you live in a segregated area and the school has mainly kids from one group, then obviously, statistically, the fights that happen will more than likely include students from the same ethno-racial grouping because they're already in a segregated situation. However, only sometimes does race appear to have any explanatory power. For example, if there's a school in a segregated neighborhood or in a state that is a majority white population and 99% of the kids at this school are white, then most of the fights will be between white kids. No one at that school would say, most of our fights are between the white kids. In that statement, the fact that the students are white means absolutely nothing. It explains nothing. It almost makes you feel like, what does their whiteness have to do with anything? Why even mention it? Now, we probably feel that because no one ever suggests anywhere that white culture creates violent white natures where kids fight because of their whiteness. That all just sounds really dumb and absurd. Now, honestly, we should feel that when we hear any version of a Black on Black violence narrative, but we don't. And why is that? Well, the white supremacist myth of violent Black people, and Black men in particular, has been retold over and over across decades, across centuries. And that narrative always said something like, Black people are primitive, dumb, irrational, dangerous, and the Black men always want to rape the white women, and the Black men always want to kill the white masters. In other words, over time, the concept Blackness has been positioned as always already violent. So then just saying something like, most of the fights are between Black students, just mentioning the fact that the students are Black, for some reason we feel like that has some kind of explanatory power. Or at least some people feel that has explanatory power. Okay, one more quote. This used to be a really good, classic Americana suburban high school. This staff member used all the tricky code words at the same time. When we say the word suburban, like when Donald Trump was trying to court the suburban vote, he was talking about white women. He was not talking about inner city moms. And the phrase classic Americana, well, that is literally just a word for whiteness. Kinda saying, good schools are full of good students who do not fight. Now it is the opposite condition. It becomes a bad school with bad students. So to review what we've talked about so far, the old school way of naturalizing or essentializing a group of people is just saying something like, Black people are violent, that's just the way it is, period, the end. But today, to get that idea across, it will sound different. Maybe it'll sound more like, Black people grew up in violent cultures, so now they are pathologically violent. And that's just the way it is, period, the end. And for a couple seconds, I want to focus in on the word pathological, because that word is hinting at a medical nature of someone. For example, when we call someone a pathological liar, we are saying that they cannot psychologically help themselves from lying. That's just the way they are, period, the end. So when we say something is pathological, we are saying something is fixed in nature. So even though sometimes more progressive folks like teachers, for example, even though they highlight societal reasons like racism or slavery or police violence, eventually the argument falls back on some version of that's just the way it is, period, the end. It's a pathological condition that emerges from culture and society. Now, at a super basic level, a pathology is medical, in this case, a psychological explanation, which then tends to make the whole conversation sound a little bit more objective and neutral or scientific. In other words, the science-y talk tends to not sound like a racially biased statement and tends to sound more like we're just talking about the medical nature of a particular group. But again, when we use the word pathology, we are referring to something that is naturally wrong with a person or a group. It appears more neutral or more friendly or more science-y, but again, the conclusion at the end is the same shit. It's still saying that there is something fundamentally wrong with the nature of Black people. But now it looks like a clinical diagnosis of a psychological nature. And this is what is so dangerous and devastating about this Black on Black narrative. People tend to feel like they just know. They know why violence happens whenever Black people are involved. Honestly, I think this is one of the larger points of this article. Conversations about a supposed Black violent nature has real life consequences. For example, what happens if a police officer just believes and expects Black persons to be dangerous and violent? I think we all know what happens. I once heard someone say, "Sticks and stones can break my bones, but words will get me shot and killed." Keeping this in mind, I want to think about the other major keyword of this article, discursive violence. Because if you understand what this term is, it kind of makes the whole article really easy to understand. As usual, let's take these words one at a time and then put them back together. Starting with the word discursive, which comes from the word discourse. So what's a discourse? Well, there's many definitions, but for now, let's think of a discourse as a popular, well-rehearsed, well-circulated narrative that tons and tons of people retell over and over. Now, we usually say stories have two sides, but really stories have like a million sides. Literally every single person that retells a story is telling the story from their own perspective. But either way, all those retellings kind of revolve around a central theme or plot or narrative. So that I remember what a discourse is, I always just think of discourse as a full or partial retelling of a recognizable narrative. Now, sometimes this retelling can be somewhat similar to earlier versions, but then also sometimes these recognizable narratives or discourses grow into something more with multiple perspectives weighing in on the same thing. For example, we can think of really popular hashtags as attached to a particular narrative. For example, hashtag Ferguson was used during the riots and rebellions that happened after yet another cop murdered another civilian. Now, people were either for or against the way the situation was handled, but the point is, both sides of the conversation still use the same hashtag Ferguson. Now, this is kind of interesting and a new phenomena, but sometimes hashtags literally give name to a recognizable discourse. You can think of tons of other ones like Stop the Steal or Oscars So White. Both of those hashtags invoke a recognizable theme or narrative that people talk about or retell stories about. Those are giant nationally recognized discourses, but not all discourses become so big that they need their own hashtags. Sometimes it could be like a mini discourse only known by a family. For example, a family legend that only your family knows. After that story is retold a few times, it becomes a recognizable narrative within this family. So again, for this article, let's define discourse as retellings of a recognizable narrative. In this sense, all the quotes from the high school adults that we just talked about are all marked by their participation in the Black on Black discourse. They are all partially retelling in different ways versions of this anti-Black discourse. Now let's think about the entire keyword, discursive violence. And inserting our previous definition, let's define discursive violence as violence that happens as an effect of the retellings of a recognizable narrative. Okay, what does that mean? Well, again, here the word violence is really hard to define, but for now, let's think of the word harm every time we see the word violence. Only because when we see the word violence, we tend to think of like physical violence. But in this article, we aren't just talking about physical harm, but many different forms of harm. For example, hurting someone's feelings is a form of harm or a form of violence. But discursive violence can also result in someone getting killed. Okay, so let's start with an easy example where we can see a very wide range of harmful effects actually happening. One famous discourse that happened around the 2020 American presidential election was the Stop the Steal discourse. Because at the time, Donald Trump kept asserting that the election was being stolen from him. And he had all of these politicians and lawyers and even his fans all retelling this Stop the Steal discourse over and over and over again. In this case, there were forms of discursive violence and harm that happened on various scales and in various intensities. Now, at the individual level, people were tricked into believing something that wasn't true, which then caused them to lose faith in the democratic system. That could definitely be seen as a form of harm. In other cases, you had families being ripped apart, like literally family members wouldn't talk to each other based on whether or not they believed the Stop the Steal discourse. Now, all of those are examples of discursive violence happening at a kind of smaller scale, in the sense that you had real people that believed in this Stop the Steal narrative and then made decisions, potentially harmful decisions, that they probably would not have normally made. But obviously we can't forget that the Stop the Steal discourse also had the effect of igniting a whole ass insurrection, a whole ass riot, where police officers died and even the Trump fan was shot and killed. So here we have a direct connection. We have a discourse that pretty much directly resulted in multiple people dying. In other words, we had these non-stop retellings of the Stop the Steal narrative, which then had the effect, the violent effect, of getting a person literally shot and killed. So remember, sticks and stones can break your bones, but words will get your ass shot and killed. Okay, so we've been talking about retellings of recognizable stories or themes, and then how those retellings kind of work like puzzle pieces that fit into a larger picture. For example, the clip of Hillary Clinton talking about super predators in the 90s, that could be imagined as an older puzzle piece that still happens to directly connect with newer puzzle pieces. And I think this is kind of the most interesting part of this article, is the way that the author shows us all these puzzle pieces and then walks us through the process of arranging those puzzle pieces to lock together. For example, and check this out, if you were to put all of those statements that were made by the adults at that high school, if you were to put them back to back and arrange them as a single paragraph, they totally make sense as a single story. But here's the thing, they make sense as a single story because they literally are part of a single story. They're literally parts of that same narrative, that same black on black violence discourse. In the article, our author lays out this process of arranging and then putting the puzzle pieces together. And she does this through an analysis of a newspaper story from the Philadelphia Inquirer. The title of the newspaper story was, "Residents Say Beatings Fit Widespread Pattern of Animosity Between Native-Born and Immigrant Blacks." So in this newspaper title, it's already kind of suggesting this is some kind of tension between native-born and immigrants. The newspaper story itself centered on a 13-year-old Liberian boy named Jacob who was beaten up at school. It was reported that, quote, "Jacob has been able to speak to detectives He told them he does not know why he was attacked. End quote. Okay, so he explicitly says he doesn't know why he was attacked. But typically journalists want to provide explanations or at least a theory as to why something happens. So this reporter goes out and finds a couple of people or local residents that they think might have some insight as to why there's tensions between Black Americans and more recent Black immigrants. Quoted in this newspaper article was a Liberian businesswoman who says, quote, "There's anger about African immigrants coming here and doing so well," she said. "You see them fixing up their houses, buying cars," end quote. Okay, so I think this statement is kind of saying something like there's tensions that are rooted in jealousy, maybe class hierarchy and economics. So perhaps we're thinking of a socioeconomic argument that explains the tension. Now, clearly this businesswoman is talking about adults. I mean, personally, I don't know any 13-year-old that is buying cars or remodeling their home. But since this interview was published in an article about potential bullying between teenagers, between Black teenagers, that socioeconomic argument will probably just be overlooked, or maybe even just read as evidence that Black folks get jealous of one another, which then usually ends in some kind of violent moment or violent event. Now, as journalists do, they're gonna want to provide as much evidence for their theory of what's going on. And often having a second person co-signing whatever the first person was proposing, that will likely work as support for an overall argument. So this journal asked another person, a 40-year-old immigrant business owner, because apparently business owners are the people most likely to understand the complex social lives of teenagers. I guess? Maybe? The business owner said, "We came here to seek refuge," he said. "Us being here, some people take it as an insult." End quote. So even though the kid in the story who got beaten up didn't know why he was beaten up, or at least didn't want to say, the journalist did the job for him by constructing puzzle piece by puzzle piece, the Black on Black violence discourse. He did such a good job constructing this Black on Black violence narrative that the blatantly white supremacist media website named Stormfront, they reposted the whole story on a thread that was titled Black Racism, Liberian Beatings, and Black Incompetence. Now, on the whole, this white supremacist poster agreed with pretty much all the premises found in the Philadelphia Inquirer article. But if you really think about it, of course support for a white supremacist myth would appear on an explicitly white supremacist website. And now to review the word discourse and discursive violence. For this article, we're defining discourse as a recognizable retelling of a narrative. And some of these discourses, as scholars have noted, result in forms of harm. That harm is called discursive violence, or the harmful effects of a discourse. And those harmful effects can range from people's feelings getting hurt to people getting shot and killed. Now, for this last example, for this last video I'm going to show you, we get to see how cops react to a white person carrying an AR-15 in public versus how they react to a Black person carrying an AR-15 in public. Where this video was filmed is in a state where it's legal to carry your weapon out in public via open carry laws. So nothing illegal is happening here. But can you guess what's about to happen to the Black guy? First, let's see what happens to the white guy with the AR-15.
How you doing, sir? Hey. Howdy. Can I see your IDs? No, sir. No. Why not?
Because I don't have to. I'm not doing crime.
Okay. Any particular reason why you're carrying the AR, especially around this point?
I'm just exercising my...
I understand that, but is there a reason why you're doing it?
I just want to walk around.
Okay, so the white guy was asked to explain and rationalize with words why he's carrying an AR-15 in public. Now keep in mind, the great super duper majority of American mass shootings are perpetrated by white men. So statistically, if we wanted to scientifically racially profile people, then statistically cops are 1,000,000 times more likely to be in danger if the person carrying the rifle is white. But then also there is this belief that if you are white, you are automatically nonviolent and automatically rational, which means that cops are way more likely to talk to white suspects before using their guns. Okay, so now let's see what happens when it's a black dude carrying a gun in a society that says black folks are pathologically violent.
He pulled out the gun. He's getting down.
So this is a very serious problem. The idea that black folk are naturally violent has real life consequences. That conversation makes possible life-threatening forms of discursive violence. This is why we need to be extra aware of how these really harmful discourses spread and then are acted upon in real life. Maybe then the saying should go, sticks and stones can break your bones, but racist discourses kill people. Well, that's all for today, folks. As usual, I'm your host, Mike Mena. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course you can support this channel directly on Patreon. This is Mike with The Social Life of Language, and we're done.